Letters of a Woman Homesteader by Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, Chapter 4. A Charming Adventure and Zebulon Pike. September 28, 1909. Dear Mrs. Coney, your second card just reached me, and I am plumb glad because, although I answered your other, I was wishing I could write you, for I have had the most charming adventure. It is the custom here for as many women as care to go in a party over into Utah, to Ashland, which is over 100 miles away, after fruit. They usually go in September, and it takes a week to make the trip. They take wagons and camp out and, of course, have a good time, but the greater part of the way there isn't even the semblance of a road, and it is merely a semblance anywhere. They came over to invite me to join them. I was of two minds. I wanted to go, but it seemed a little risky and a big chance for discomfort, since we would have to cross the Uinta Mountains, and a snowstorm likely any time. But I didn't like to refuse outright, so we left it to Mr. Stewart. His "your nay gang" sounded powerful final, so the ladies departed in awed silence, and I assumed a martyr-like air and acted like a very much abused woman, although he did only what I wanted him to do. At last, in sheer desperation, he told me the bairn canna stand the treep, and that was why he was so determined. I knew why, of course, but I continued to look abused, lest he gets it into his head that he can boss me. After he had been reduced to the proper plane of humility and had explained and begged my pardon, and had told me to consult only my own pleasure about going and coming and using his horses, only not to expose the bairn, why, I forgave him and we were friends once more. Next day all the men left for the roundup, to be gone a week. I knew I never could stand myself a whole week. In a little while the ladies came past on their way to Ashland. They were all laughing and were so happy that I really began to wish I was one of the number, but they went their way and I kept wanting to go somewhere. I got reckless and determined to do something real bad. So I went down to the barn and saddled Robin Adair, placed a pack on James McGregor, then Jerrine and I left for a camping out expedition. It was 9 o'clock when we started, and we rode hard until about 4, when I turned Robin loose, saddle and all, for I knew he would go home and someone would see him and put him into the pasture. We had gotten to where we couldn't ride anyway, so I put Jerrine on the pack and led James for about 2 hours longer. Then, as I had come to a good place to camp, we stopped. While we had at least 2 good hours of daylight, it gets so cold here in the evening that fire is very necessary. We had been climbing higher into the mountains all day and had reached a level tableland where the grass was luxuriant and there was plenty of wood and water. I unpacked James and staked him out, built a roaring fire, and made our bed in an angle of a sheer wall of rock where we would be protected against the wind. Then I put some potatoes into the embers, as Baby and I are both fond of roasted potatoes. I started to a little spring to get water for my coffee when I saw a couple of jackrabbits playing, so I went back for my little shotgun. I shot one of the rabbits, so I felt very like Leatherstocking, because I had killed but one when I might have gotten 2. It was fat and young, and it was but the work of a moment to dress it and hang it up on a tree. Then I fried some slices of bacon, made myself a cup of coffee, and Jerrine and I sat on the ground and ate. Everything smelled and tasted so good. This air is so tonic that one gets delightfully hungry. Afterward we watered and restaked James. I rolled some logs onto the fire, and then we sat and enjoyed the prospect. The moon was so new that its light was very dim, but the stars were bright. Presently a long quivering wail arose and was answered from a dozen hills. It seemed just the sound one ought to hear in such a place. When the howls ceased for a moment, we could hear the subdued roar of the creek and the crooning of the wind in the pines. So we rather enjoyed the coyote chorus and were not afraid, because they don't attack people. Presently we crept under our Navajos, and being tired, were soon asleep. I was awakened by a pebble striking my cheek. Something prowling on the bluff above us had dislodged it, and it struck me. By my Waterbury, it was 4 o'clock, so I arose and spitted my rabbit. The logs had left a big bed of coals, but some ends were still burning and had burned in such a manner that the heat would go both under and over my rabbit. So I put plenty of bacon grease over him and hung him up to roast. Then I went back to bed. I didn't want to start early because the air is too keen for comfort early in the morning. The sun was just gilding the hilltops when we arose. Everything, even the barrenness, was beautiful. We have had frosts, and the quaking aspens were a trembling field of gold as far up the stream as we could see. We were way up above them and could look far across the valley. We could see the silvery gold of the willows, the russet and bronze of the currants, and patches of cheerful green showed where the pines were. The splendor was relieved by a background of sober gray-green hills, but even on them gay streaks and patches of yellow showed where rabbit brush grew. We washed our faces at the spring. The grasses that grew around the edge and dipped into the water were loaded with ice. Our rabbit was done to a turn, so I made some delicious coffee, Jerrine got herself a can of water, and we breakfasted. Shortly afterwards we started again. We didn't know where we were going, but we were on our way. That day was more toilsome than the last, but a very happy one. The meadowlarks kept singing like they were glad to see us, but we were still climbing and soon got beyond the larks and sage chickens and up into the timber, where there are lots of grouse. We stopped to noon by a little lake, where I got 2 small squirrels and a string of trout. We had some trout for dinner and salted the rest, with the squirrels and an empty can for future use. I was anxious to get a grouse and kept close watch, but was never quick enough. Our progress was now slower and more difficult because in places we could scarcely get through the forest. Fallen trees were everywhere, and we had to avoid the branches, which was powerful hard to do. Besides, it was quite dusky among the trees, long before night, but it was all so grand and awe-inspiring. Occasionally there was an opening through which we could see the snowy peaks, seemingly just beyond us, toward which we were headed. But when you get among such grandeur, you get to feel how little you are and how foolish is human endeavor, except that which reunites us with the mighty force called God. I was plumb uncomfortable because all my own efforts have always been just to make the best of everything and to take things as they come. At last we came to an open side of the mountain where the trees were scattered. We were facing south and east, and the mountain we were on sheered away in a dangerous slant. Beyond us, still greater wooded mountains blocked the way, and in the canyon between, night had already fallen. I began to get scary. I could only think of bears and catamounts, so as it was 5 o'clock, we decided to camp. The trees were immense. The lower branches came clear to the ground and grew so dense that any tree afforded a splendid shelter from the weather. But I was nervous and wanted one that would protect us against any possible attack. At last we found one growing in a crevice of what seemed to be a sheer wall of rock. Nothing could reach us on 2 sides, and in front 2 large trees had fallen so that I could make a log heap which would give us warmth and make us safe. So with rising spirits I unpacked and prepared for the night. I soon had a roaring fire up against the logs, and, cutting away a few branches, let the heat into as snug a bedroom as anyone could wish. The pine needles made as soft a carpet as the wealthiest could afford. Springs abound in the mountains, so water was plenty. I staked Jeems quite near so that the firelight would frighten away any wild thing that tried to harm him. Grass was very plentiful, so when he was made comfy, I made our bed and fried our trout. The branches had torn off the bag in which I had my bread, so it was lost in the forest. But who needs bread when they have good mealy potatoes? In a short time we were eating like Lent was just over. We lost all the glory of the sunset except what we got by reflection, being on the side of the mountain we were, with the dense woods between. Big sullen clouds kept drifting over, and a wind got lost in the trees that kept them rocking and groaning in a horrid way. But we were just as cozy as we could be, and rest was as good as anything. I wish you could once sleep on the kind of bed we enjoyed that night. It was both soft and firm, with the clean, spicy smell of the pine. The heat from our big fire came in, and we were warm as toast. It was so good to stretch out and rest. I kept thinking how superior I was, since I dared to take such an outing when so many poor women down in Denver were bent on making their 20 cents per hour in order that they could spare a quarter to go to the show. I went to sleep with a powerfully self-satisfied feeling, but I awoke to realize that pride goeth before a fall. I could hardly remember where I was when I awoke, and I could almost hear the silence. Not a tree moaned, not a branch seemed to stir. I arose, and my head came in violent contact with a snag that was not there when I went to bed. I thought either I must have grown taller or the tree shorter during the night. As soon as I peered out, the mystery was explained. Such a snowstorm I never saw. The snow had pressed the branches down lower, hence my bumped head. Our fire was burning merrily, and the heat kept the snow from in front. I scrambled out and poked up the fire. Then, as it was only 5 o'clock, I went back to bed. And then I began to think how many kinds of idiot I was. Here I was, 30 or 40 miles from home, in the mountains, where no one goes in the winter, and where I knew the snow got to be 10 or 15 feet deep. But I could never see the good of moping, so I got up and got breakfast while Baby put her shoes on. We had our squirrels and more baked potatoes, and I had delicious black coffee. After I had eaten, I felt more hopeful. I knew Mr. Stewart would hunt for me if he knew I was lost. It was true he wouldn't know which way to start, but I determined to rig up Jeems and turn him loose, for I knew he would go home and that he would leave a trail so that I could be found. I hated to do so, for I knew I should always have to be powerfully humble afterwards. Anyway, it was still snowing, great heavy flakes. They looked as large as dollars. I didn't want to start Jeems until the snow stopped because I wanted him to leave a clear trail. I had 16 loads for my gun, and I reasoned that I could likely kill enough food to last twice that many days by being careful what I shot at. It just kept snowing, so at last I decided to take a little hunt and provide for the day. I left Jerrine happy with the towel rolled into a baby, and went along the brow of the mountain for almost a mile, but the snow fell so thickly that I couldn't see far. Then I happened to look down into the canyon that lay east of us and saw smoke. I looked toward it a long time, but could make out nothing but smoke. But presently I heard a dog bark, and I knew I was near a camp of some kind. I resolved to join them, so went back to break my own camp.